Well, good evening, everyone, and a Happy New Year to those of you who haven't seen before in 2014. For the benefit of members of the public present and applicants and objectors, we'll explain the proceeding as we get to your part in it. First, I have to tell everybody that we are not expecting a fire alarm this evening, so if we hear something that sounds like a fire alarm, we'll assume it is a fire alarm. And we're invited to leave the building by the fire exits, which are clearly marked. If you have been signed into the building and your presence is recorded, please don't rush away, because we need to count the heads, and we'll stand in the pouring rain in Memorial Park. You'll be glad to know we haven't had that to happen so far in this committee, in my memory. Let's hope it doesn't happen again. It doesn't happen for the first time. Also, please note that the meeting is being webcast, so the members are all familiar with this and the officers, but when you come forward to speak at the front here, you will be on the webcast. It will switch to you when you press the button to speak, and you'll be broadcasting to the huge international audience that watches this live or in its recorded form. And you can show your grandchildren when you get home, when it goes live on the website the second time around, which is a week or so hence. I have no apologies for absence. Congratulate members on a full house, which has not been the pattern recently, but it's very good to see. There are no, as far as I know, no resignations or replacements. Am I right? Are there any declarations of interest? I have no urgent items or announcements. I have... Yes, the lead officer would like to tell us something which is not particularly good news.
Thank you, Chair. It's just to inform members that this afternoon we received the appeal decision for the Kennel Farm appeal, which was an outline application for 310 dwellings, which went to public inquiry in November. The appeal was allowed, so effectively the council lost the appeal. The inspectors haven't had a chance to digest all of the information, but the inspector found that there weren't any substantial adverse impacts from the development, and that any adverse impacts identified didn't significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits of the housing supply and affordable housing provided. An application for costs was made at the inquiry, but we haven't received that decision at this moment in time. We are chasing the planning inspectorate for that, and we'll obviously update members as soon as we have that.
We are getting a very clear signal from Her Majesty's Inspectorate on these matters, I think, and quite consistent. We have the minutes of two meetings, the 11th, both in your folders, the 11th and 18th of December. Does anyone have any points they want to pick up on those minutes? No? Right, again.
Thank you, Chair. Just in relation to the minutes for the 18th of December, item 6, which was the 3 dwellings of land at Church Road, Wolverton, the minutes should have included that section 106 had a requirement for the land to be tied, the dwellings to be tied to the land as well. So subject to the committee's agreement, which was what was agreed last time, they'd be included in the minutes at the next meeting.
If I'm right, that is the application of the 3 dwellings for agricultural need, which was regarded as being against policy. It is going to PI committee. 1 or 2 members have questioned officers as to the rationale under which that goes to P&I, whether it's appropriate and justified. And I've asked Mike to, at the end of the formal business of the meeting, which I'll close, we will then have a brief statement from Mike about that, and brief questions. I don't have a big debate about the particular issue, because it was my ruling as chairman, and it was my ruling as chairman, and if it's wrong, I take the blame. So we're not having a debate about whether it was right or wrong. It's just that for information purposes, there were some members who were not fully aware of why that happens in a general case and why it happened in that particular case. So we'll go back to that at the end of the meeting. I will sign the minutes at the end, Mike. There are no referrals from other committees or the council or from the cabinet. So we move on to the applications for planning consent. And I'll ask if there are any speakers for the first application. Have the applicant, Mr. Inca? If you'd like to come forward, sir, and just sit at that table, we'll explain what's going on for your benefit and the rest of the people. What we're going to do now is the officers will present their report, We will then invite you to speak for a maximum of 4 minutes. At the 3-minute point, I will, if you're still going, politely interject until you've got a minute left. And then you stay there after you've done that, because members will have the opportunity to ask you questions, which gives you a bit more time if they do. When you speak, you need to press the big wide black button and then speak. And when you're finished, you have to press it again, because otherwise the rest of the members can't get their, or the officers can't get their button pressed, and it's one at a time except me. Okay, so firstly, the officers will present the application.
Okay. Item 1 is the application that proposes conversion of the existing 3-bedroom dwelling at 104 Melrose Walk into a 1 number 1-bed flat and 1 number 2-bed maisonette. The application is brought to committee at the request of the ward councillors. Members of the viewing panel visited the site and noted the extended width of the vehicle crossover to the rear of the site. Officers have looked at this and believe that this was undertaken lawfully and is not unauthorised development. The update on the item confirms that additional objections have been received, and they've been received from both ward members and 3 members of the public. In summary, these relate to the proposed parking arrangement, parking impacts generally in the location, and pedestrian safety. The cycle and bin store provision is a concern. Privacy of the ground floor flat has been noted, and the rear boundary definition concern in terms of that potentially being opened up in the future. Officers have considered these matters, and with the exception of the further condition to secure submission of boundary details and a further contribution, should say, towards community facilities, the recommendation remains for approval, subject to the completion of an appropriate legal agreement and the conditions set out in both the main and update reports.
I'm reminded that I should have told you whoever all these people are. It's a bit baffling, isn't it? On either side of the table, down to and including the very elegant gentleman in the green pullover, and down to including the even more elegant lady in the grey. And I'm very bad on colours, so don't argue about the colours. Cambridge blue, we say, it's a much nicer colour than grey, are the members who will discuss and ask questions of officers and vote on the application. I'm the chairman and this is my deputy. We're also members and we can also vote and speak. And then the other people around the corners here are officers who are here to advise us on policy and procedure, and whether we're breaking the law or anything like that, which we try not to do. And now you have 4 minutes to tell us about your application. Thank you.
Evening, honourable ladies and gentlemen. I'd just like to introduce myself as Ben Inker. Obviously I'm the owner and occupier and applicant for this proposed development. And I'd like to take this opportunity to wish you all Happy New Year. I trust you've all seen the details of the documents and read the relevant reports from those in the know. I'm just here to present myself as an opportunity for you to ask any questions just for clarification, and I'll leave that open to you for now on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I tell you, I suspect you've broken a record for the shortest contribution, which we greatly appreciate and we're grateful for that. Thank you very much. Right, members, you've been invited to ask questions. Would you like to do so, Paul?
Thank you, Chair. One simple one. I just heard you say, excuse me, I think my hearing's okay. Occupier? Owner, occupier?
Yes, that's correct. I own the property and I live in the property currently.
Any other questions? David, and then George.
Hi, Mr. Inker. I mean, as with Councillor Miller, I mean, hearing that you're the occupier of the current building, does that mean you have a knowledge of Melrose Walk and its current mix of housing? I mean, you know historically how many have already been converted into HMOs, do you?
I have had a brief look back through the planning details. I understand a similar property application was made not only 2 doors from my property, which was approved at appeal, but I believe hasn't been completed as a conversion. I understand and have noted there are blocks of flats within the Melrose Walk line, but for the majority are still 3-bedroom properties with rear gardens and in the same format as my property currently is.
Just for the benefit of the webcast, my understanding is this is not an application for an HMO, it's an application for a house to be developed and divided into 2 dwellings. Is that right?
That's correct, yes. Thank you.
It's my terminology, obviously, Chairman. Perhaps I could change that, but certainly my my language is my own language, so clearly I'll take the rebuke from the chair as we go through this.
For clarity, that's not a rebuke. HMO is a planning term, and we're a planning committee, and I don't want something going on the web that people will clearly misunderstand and think we've made a decision based on a misunderstanding. There's no objection to anybody using their own language, as long as it's reasonably civil. I think George had his hand up.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, Mr. Inker. Regards to parking, currently as it stands now, you would drive in a forward gear, where you would have to reverse out in a reverse gear. How secure do you think the safety arrangements are for that? Do you feel it would be quite safe to do that with the amount of children which use that area to get to school and other pedestrians? Oh, sorry, I'm a second.
Yes, I have had a look at the other parking, and on advice from my planning officer, it is observed people will typically park in forward. I typically park in reverse. The highway code suggests you're not supposed to reverse out onto any road. Melrose Walk is a pedestrianised walkway which has quite a large number of footpaths, none of which cross the rear boundary of this property. So there's no reason with the footpath layout that any pedestrians would be at the rear of the property. I understand the concern, pedestrians and children particularly, being that there's a school very nearby, but I think from my observations of how people drive and how I personally enter and exit my property, I've certainly not had any incursions with any pedestrians.
Any further questions? Thank you, sir. If you'd like to withdraw, I don't think we have any objectors, or there's no parish council, any objectors. So we have the ward councillors. Are you both coming forward at the same time, or is one representative? What are we doing? Good evening, Jane. Happy New Year. You have, when you're ready, you have 4 minutes. But we'll start when you're ready.
First and foremost, can I say that the mix actually is not mainly houses. It's 84 flats and there were 52 houses. Not the case now. I found this application one of the most conflicting and difficult to read, so I'll concentrate on the amended plans as being the most recent. The proposal is for one car to be parked in the garden area and 2 outside the garden on the highways. Highways are giving permission to cross the verge. Does this mean that all tarmac areas are highways and calculated in the available parking? I had occasion recently in the application to extend Merton School, where there was a transport report that there was 472 public parking spaces. Obviously it was proved it wasn't the case, because later I was told these tarmac areas in front of the resident garages were meant to be for access and egress for the garages and not public parking. Can you imagine the mayhem if you could not get your car out of the garage because a stranger had parked there and left it? And these, if they are for parking, are they for just the occupants? There needs to be a decision on this as it affects the borough when counting parking facilities. How do Basingstoke and Dean calculate this? I don't know how, so this needs to be done right. I don't know how you get the bins out for collection or how you get a bicycle out, for both outside parking spaces are being used. The application mentions unallocated parking spaces frequently, but no mention as to how many properties use these few so-called unallocated spaces. The parking on them is at the discretion of Sentinel, and as some members of this committee know, where parking got so bad, Sentinel withdrew the right for anyone to park there, only a tenant. Also, in areas where parking is as bad as you saw mid-morning last Friday, the fire service have had to deliver letters about the parking, so this can affect the delivery of the service in a timely manner. This affects other emergency services, such as the ambulances that you saw on Friday, when there was a rapid response ambulance, followed by a full ambulance to the property where, unfortunately, they had to call quite frequently. There were cars on the green and along the side of the road in this small cul-de-sac. If the property changes hands, new residents may well have even more vehicles. I spoke to a resident who actually had a house converted, not very far from this property, and she agreed she was part of the problem, because her planning application was for the cars to be parked on the property, and she didn't like looking out and seeing the cars, so she converted it back to half garden, using up the parking spaces.
You've got 1 minute, Jane.
Oh, sorry. I need to actually get down to, in Appendix 9, the subdivisions and houses in multiple occupancy, you will find that about properties, there'd be 2 black bins, 2 green bins. It affects natural light, because the only light for the bottom flat on this end will be looking out on bins, cycle tracks, and there's no indication actually of what order they're going to do. Reasons for refusal are mostly in the Appendix 9 subdivision. The bullet points in the introduction are contravened. Also, Policy D4, adverse impact on amenities of adjoining properties. Policy E1(2) on traffic. And on page 2, under basic requirements, Para 1, mid-terrace properties. Para 3, windows and natural light. Para 5, refuse storage. Para 7, parking. On page 4,
could you
Para
wind up?
2.
Jane, could you wind up, please?
All right, I am actually winding up. There is no assessment which was needed on the dwelling stock. It was clear that the applicant didn't know the mix. So there are many strong reasons for refusal, and I asked you to refuse this application.
Thank you. If you'd like to just sit there, we'll see if members have any questions.
Jane, sorry, good evening. Sorry, I mean, obviously, I think what you're referring to is what's contained, obviously, within the officer report of Appendix 9 design and sustainability, SPD, subdivision of dwellings and houses, multiple occupation. In terms of the assessment of the local dwelling stock, and obviously I want to get at this in due course with officers, but from your knowledge and your work that you've done on this one in regard to the local area, do you know what the current mix is? How many dwellings have already been converted, what we're talking about in the context of Melrose Walk?
Sorry. Obviously, as a resident in the area for over 40 years and done a lot of research on this, Melrose Walk was 136 in all, 52 were houses, 8 at least have now been converted, which is over 15% of the stock. And the idea was to have so many flats, so many houses. It's changing the whole dynamics by increasing the flats. So yes, that's the mix.
Any more questions? No? Thank you very much, Jane. Go to questions to officers, and I'm sure members will wish to ask some of the questions that Jane mentioned in her beginning of her contribution, and we'll start with Chris, if we may.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question, really, for the officers on page 7 of 48, section 7, car parking standards. Just to clarify, to help me, the second paragraph there states a 2-bedroom dwelling would be 1.75 rounded to 2, and a single bedroom property would be 1.25 rounded to 2. So you could argue that's 4, couldn't you? But we're seeing 3 on this application because if you add 1.25 and 1.75 together, you get 3. So are we looking for 4 spaces when they're only providing 3, or are we somehow, because it's in one site, looking at 3 and they are providing 3? Do I explain myself?
The application description as it is in this circumstance, we are looking at the combined parking requirement for the 2 1-bed and then 2-bed units. It's the 1.25 plus the 1.75, giving the total for 3 spaces.
So that's our standard for when 2 individual dwellings become one building. I mean, are we caught in an interpretation of a rule here?
I think the situation is because it is all in the same application, so it's different if you like. If you're applying parking standards across a development, for example, you would do the number of dwellings, number of bedrooms times 1.25 or 1.75, however it works out. In this instance, because it is a combined, the application is as a whole. It's the 1-bed and the 2-bed on one application site. Then our interpretation of how the parking standards would be applied would be that combined amount. So it would be the 1.25 and the 1.75 as a whole.
Paul, I think, could you put your hands up again, those who wish to, and yeah, Michael and then David. Yeah, Paul.
Thank you, Chair. It's along the same lines, but I'm trying to get myself oriented with the update sheet, and it was included in the main diagrams, or the diagrams in the report that's before us, with a reference on these maps of Abbey Road. Abbey Road is nowhere near this property if you look at the site diagram. Now, I'm still trying to get my head around that. I think it might be an error in the way that the maps have been interpreted, but Abbey Road is not at the immediate rear of that property. Melrose Walk is literally a walk. It's not. It's a wide pathway near the front door of the existing property. Behind it is not Abbey Road. It's part of the cul-de-sac area. So, it throws you off when you try and interpret these diagrams. That's an observation. But on the viewing, we were getting a little confused about where is the walkway, or is there meant to be a walkway, between the tarmac access road, I don't know its name, that's why I can't describe it, at the rear of the property, off it's probably part of the highways, I don't know, but on this, what we call the service strip that runs along the back. Now, is there meant to be a walkway down there for pedestrians? That's the first question.
Between the southern boundary of the property and the adjacent carriageway, there is a grass highway verge that runs east-west. That also has a number of vehicle crossovers which come from the driveways of the original dwellings, which were originally designed with integral garages. So there's no east-west running pedestrian footway along that frontage.
Following, I assume then that you would encourage pedestrians to walk on that little strip of road. That's what I'm hearing at the moment.
With it being with the way that type of housing was designed, the principal pedestrian route is Melrose Walk, shown on the north side of the property, with the houses fronting onto that. So the cul-de-sac at the rear is effectively like a service area. So yes, that carriageway within that cul-de-sac area is effectively operating as a shared surface without segregated footways that you might expect for an all-purpose cul-de-sac where the houses are actually facing onto that cul-de-sac.
Would you expect that any vehicles parked along this service area can park behind, because we're going to have two different entrances to this property, should this application be granted, that will, well, I think that's a very good photograph that's just been put up, is that they overhang the curb for a start. And 2 vehicles plus 1 in the garden is acceptable from a highways perspective and a parking standards perspective, because that garden's got a tree stump in it. You wouldn't get a car into that back garden.
My understanding is that with this proposal, we will end up with 2 spaces in tandem, which is a conventional layout, and the next single space. So the applicant will need to relay that area of hard standing to provide the 2 tandem spaces and the single space next to it. Having tandem spaces perpendicular to the carriageway is quite a common parking layout.
And I'd like to come back to the observation that was made again about parking arrangements. We've had many applications before this committee where highways insist that a vehicle must have turning space to go to exit the property in a forward gear. Now, this obviously cannot be done because of the space available, but it sounds like a double standard depending on the design of the property. Is that correct?
The rule of thumb with the provision of turning facilities is certainly if it's a classified road, A, B or a C road, I would have an expectation that on-site turning would be provided. But also there can be other circumstances where visibility may not be ideal or something like that, where we would also look to achieve forward visibility, looking at the ability for vehicles to enter and exit in the forward gear, looking at how that development proposal would operate as a whole. For this particular area, being within a residential cul-de-sac, I couldn't see a justification to require that on-site turning, and certainly the original houses with their integral garage and their single-width drives were all designed without turning, on-site turning, so these are characteristic of the way the estate was designed.
Thank you for that. The other thing that concerned many of the councillors that were on the viewing panel was the way other vehicles were scattered all over the area. They were chewing up the grass areas. There were 5 cars that I saw on the grass, which indicates there's insufficient parking in there for the way that maybe it's the sign of the times. But there was the point was, you're asking for a parking space to be included inside the garden area. There wasn't one vehicle inside a garden area on that street. Now, they're all designed to accept cars down to the garage doors, but not one vehicle was in the garden area.
Can we make it a question? That's a discussion point.
If we're making that ruling on this particular case, I'll ask the question, was it imposed on the other property that was... I'm looking at consistency here. Was there an assistance in the conditions on the other property that was, I think, changed its configuration some little time back?
The answer is they probably don't know without looking at the archives. They probably wouldn't have that information with them.
Okay, I didn't think it was that long
No,
ago. Notwithstanding that,
No.
okay. Thank you very much.
I have Mike, I think, was it? And then David, and then Marilyn.
Sorry, Chair, this goes back to the parking arrangements. I see that on the map that we've got on the update, suggested parking for the outside on that sort of tarmac area, we've got ground floor flat and maisonette, and inside we presume we've got another ground floor flat parking. I just want to know how that's actually going to operate. One has to assume, presumably, that these people are going to get on to start with, which isn't always the case. So you can go and ask somebody to move their vehicle so that you can get your vehicle out. I don't really see how it's going to work in an equitable way. Perhaps it could
Can
be
we
explained.
put the diagram up that's included in the update, please, so everyone knows what we're talking about? It's the one with the hashing over the recycle bin and the general refuse. It looks prima facie as if the vehicle parked on the left can't get past the bin area.
Okay, if I'll try and clarify that point. In terms of the plan you've got there on the screen in front of you, as you're looking at it, the parking space that's on your left is for the ground floor flat, which is the one bed. So there's one space there. And then in terms of what you're seeing on the right-hand side there, you've got the maisonette parking space within the application site, and then the suggested maisonette parking space is denoted there that sits behind it. So those two spaces relate to the first floor two-bed.
I made a mistake, I think, in it's the course. Yes, yeah, I got my number of park. Yes, okay. I still think it's going to be problems.
David.
Thank you, Chair. If I may, it's all related. It's a multiple question, and I think the officers might better answer in the way I ask it. In terms of this type of application, my understanding is that the applicant is obligated as part of that application to submit an assessment of local dwelling stock, and I am not sure whether that is part of this and has been done. I mean, you can answer that. Assuming that he hasn't for a minute, and I'm sure you're going to tell me whether he's obligated or not in that regard, but assuming he hasn't, is it possible for officers to confirm whether Councillor Frankham's assessment that something like 15% of the existing housing stock have already been converted in a not dissimilar way to what is being proposed here? And the third part, I think, really is for all of us, I guess, really in the context of this type of development. I mean, is there any limit in regard to the conversion of such family houses in an area like this? Is 15% acceptable? Is 30% acceptable? How far does that go on in terms of applications of this sort which convert dwellings in this way before it so fundamentally affects that area? It just seems to me these are questions that need to be asked of ourselves, if nothing else really, in regard to the way, because this is inevitable, it seems to me, that we're going to be faced with one application after another in an area such as this, and there has to be some limit in that in regard to the sort of parking provision and other things that go with that. Can I just ask for some guidance on it, please?
Okay. In terms of the first point in the obligation to submit a housing stock mix with the application, my understanding is that it's not an obligation, it's a requirement of the policy for consideration to take place, and that's something that, whilst it would be helpful if the applicant had provided that, it's not an obligation. The officer has undertaken that assessment based on the information that's contained in the report there, and they were satisfied on that point, so it's not an obligation.
But it's only the sort of commentary that's made within the very document we're talking about. This information is important in determining planning applications in unders. Now, I mean, is how you interpret that. I mean, obviously we want that information. It's how it's provided in the first place. But providing we've got it from some source, that's all we need then, is that right?
I think the point that the SPD is making is that in support of an application, cumulative impact and housing stock is a consideration. And effectively, the SPD is giving an indicator to applicants that it would be useful to provide that information. It's not something that we can insist upon as part of the application process. So they're not obligated to submit it. And if it's not submitted, then we do undertake our own research. And in this case, it's based on the planning history of the area which the case officer has looked into. I don't think the figures quite tally with what Councillor Mrs. Frankham has said. I'm not doubting what Councillor Mrs. Frankham is saying, just for clarity, but simply in terms of the planning history, it had a slightly lesser number of units that had been granted permission, such as this. Page 8, second paragraph under local dwelling stock, apparently 13 applications been received looking at the planning history of Melrose Walk. 5 of which have been granted, 1 withdrawn, 6 refused, and this application is currently pending. And 1 we understand hasn't been implemented, which I believe might be the one a couple of doors down from this current application.
You've finished, or are you coming back?
It was the third part, and it may be, in a sense rhetorical on my part, but it's the question of, is there any view that officers have, experts have, about, in such situations, how far it is reasonable for us to consider the whole environment, the built environment, because it's very easy, isn't it, for us to take one at a time without actually considering the cumulative effect. It seems to me, ultimately, and this is an extreme hypothesis, I know, but all of these dwellings, because of their history, because of their purchase away from social landlords and the like, now lend themselves to this type of conversion. And it seems to me that has massive implications in that type of area on family units. And I just want to know what our officers' view is, if I might ask that first of all, Chair, about where we draw a line on this, if we draw a line.
I think it's the phrase is it's each case on its merits. It's an iterative process, and the consideration that's been given here takes into consideration the facts as we understand them. Drawing an example, we could go down many tangents and say that the next one might be acceptable and the next one might be unacceptable. It's assessing the impacts of each application as it comes in, if it comes in, and I think that's the approach of the SPD and the policy. So I don't think there's an arbitrary 15% that's going to be acceptable or not. I think it is each application, each proposal on its merits at that time of the point of submission.
Brilliant. There will be any more questions? Thank you.
I'd like, if I may, to come back to the access, in that if the small flat will only be able... Sorry. The small flat, as I understand it, will only go in and out of the front door. So the only way between a car and the front door is to literally go round, down the alleyway, round all the way round. And to that, I'm right, aren't I? That is how I see it.
With reference to the proposed floor plan in the report, my understanding is that the ground floor flat, though it does have its primary entrance from the north on Melrose Walk itself, remote from the car parking, it also has a doorway on the south elevation from the lounge. So both properties do enjoy a pedestrian access directly to and from the proposed parking area. That's it for the ground floor. So, yep.
Thank you. I obviously had missed that. I was really concerned that everybody was going to have to go sort of round and about the whole time, which is fine. What had concerned me was under the main access bit on page 5. They say, whilst it would be preferable to only have one external doorway, as per the SPD, given that the proposal would utilise existing front and rear, there is considered to be no demonstrable harm. So that's the case. That is the alternative.
George.
Thank you, Chair. My questions are to highways. Can I put up the latest picture of the... Yes, please. Yeah. Now the view, actual view of the property. Yeah. Yeah, that's the one. That's one. You see, the more I look at this, the more concerned I've got. First of all, we identify there is a drain there. So cars leaving the site would access over the drain. It's also a dropped curb. In most cases, a dropped curb is for use of pedestrians, but I think in this case it's purely used for the proprietor to use that for access. I'm still unhappy with the fact that we're reversing out. And I remember many years ago we set a policy, whether it was no longer there. You had to drive in on a forward gear and be able to leave the site again on a forward gear. But now you say that's not practical in the case like this. I can't help thinking, especially in the winter when it gets a bit dark early, children, parents come along there. We had to be extremely vigilant. The driver would have to be to make sure that his sight line was clear of any oncoming pedestrians. So I'm a bit surprised that we've said today highways as almost endorsing it, because I can see a lot of problems there.
Sorry, was there a question?
Yes.
is there an issue associated with having the cars coming over a grid?
The gully gratings would be designed to a standard that is appropriate to its location, being within a carriageway. So therefore, I wouldn't foresee a problem with vehicles overriding the gully. And I think that has been in place. That arrangement has been in place for at least a year. So it all seemed to be satisfactory when it's today.
I've always learned something at development control. I now know that it's called a gully grating. That's great help for my future. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to use that against somebody. David.
I'm not very loud, so I better bring it nearer my mouth. On that picture, can you tell me where the sign is? Is that a footpath or is that not a footpath? To the right, it looks like a footpath. To the left, oh, isn't that clever? So it's not. It's a grass. Okay. Thank you.
If nobody else is going to ask it, I'll ask it. What is the policy with regard to tarmacking over grass verges? I mean, could every house potentially get agreement to tarmac over its grass verge so there's no grass left anywhere? And who would be responsible for moving the sign which prevents the unfortunate people behind it from tarmacking over their grass verge?
Because the highway verge is managed by Hampshire County Council, if a resident wishes to apply to alter that highway verge or even a footway to convert it into a vehicle crossover, which would include the lowering of the curb and the strengthening of the materials within that area to withstand the vehicle loading, they would need to apply to the County Council for a highway licence for those works to be undertaken in accordance with Hampshire County Council's standard specification, which to my knowledge would normally be of a tarmac type construction.
That's about.
One question concerning the parking. It's got suggested parking. Is there anything, any informative or something that could be put in that says designated parking?
There isn't, unfortunately, because that area falls outside of the application site.
Is that the questions finished? Right, I'll now have discussion. Those who would like to contribute to that? Nobody's straining at the leash here. Paul, you kick off.
If it's, you've just heard that it's outside the area, doesn't that bring a new dimension to this whole business of the parking? It's not contained within the application area, curtilage, whatever you want to say. You could turn around and say you can park down the street. All my relative, I don't say long experience on DC, but all the parking that we've probably always considered has been within the curtilage of the property. Now this strikes me as this could be interpreted, suggested by the members of this committee as street parking. It's got nothing to do with the boundary of the property.
I think, treating this case on its merits, that area does directly relate to the adjacent curtilage of the application site. So it is technically the case that that land does fall outside of the applicant's site. However, looking at how closely related that land is to the property, and that at least half that land has historically provided the vehicular access to the on-site parking facilities in the previous garage before it's converted, I think there's a reasonable prospect that that land will be used in connection with the occupation of the proposed development.
Back to you in a second, Dan, but while we're on that, I had failed to ask somebody to draw my attention to whereabouts is the secure cycle parking supposed to be on all these diagrams? I missed that.
In answer to that question, that's the subject matter of condition number 3 that's attached to the permission. Officers are satisfied it can be provided, but the details where it will be provided in the site is something that will be dealt with via that condition.
Diane.
This is really a question, again, I'm afraid, on the parking issue. These are quite different standards from anything that we'd encounter in a rural area, I can assure you. You'd be ever so strict about it there. I'm just asking, therefore, if a car that relates to the maisonette parks on the land, another car that's completely unrelated could choose to park right behind it and box it in. I mean, is that allowed? And surely that would be not a very pleasant scenario for the people who occupy the maisonette.
In the scenario where the internal space was obstructed by another vehicle parked outside, I would have thought that would still count as an obstruction, so the owner would still be able to take action due to that obstruction occurring, in the same way that if somebody was to park in front of your driveway in a normal arrangement. So that I don't see it as being any different to a normal driveway. It's just the position of the back fence is further offset away from the carriageway than it normally would be.
So if the car that's unrelated parks on the other side where it isn't obstructing a driveway, it's just in front of the bin area, that could also happen then, and therefore they've lost one of their designated places.
Strictly speaking, it could. However, looking at the way that area operates currently, it is a characteristic of that area that people choose to park in front of their dwellings on that area.
Just, you know, what I'm rather sensing here, members, is two things. One is members will obviously determine the application following discussion as to their best views as to its legitimacy in policy terms, and the other is that members may be seeking to ask that the SPD be revisited with a view to clarifying this type of matter. It seems to me, as an observation, since we're in discussion, since there doesn't seem to be a great queue of people to speak, that while the parking here may or may not, depending on one's interpretation, and I understand the way people are coming at that, may or may not technically meet policy requirements. The question that I believe doesn't seem to have been addressed is, given the picture we see and that members have reported from the site visits, given that the picture we see of the street, does it actually meet practical requirements in the local specific context? And it seems to me that there are two dimensions to parking. One is the formal, like everything else, one is what the policy actually says and how you could interpret it so that it's within policy because you've said it is. And the other is what the policy says and how that fits the local practicalities or not of the situation. And officers will guide us as to their view on my second approach to it, which says this looks as if not very many people park, and we've had the report that said didn't see anybody park. Actually on the premises, they all park in the street. And therefore the notional idea of two cars being parked in the premises is only notional, because in practice it doesn't happen. On the question of pedestrians, I'm really sensitive what the officers are saying here, that this is a back cul-de-sac, and as has always been the place where you put your car, and you're meant to walk through your front door to go and walk, and then you walk through your back door to get your car. But of course, if it's the case that most people find they've got to park one of their cars further away from their property, they're going to walk to it in that street. So there is walking going on, and you can't say there's no walking. And the other point that arises, as far as I'm concerned, and I raised this with officers before the meeting, having read the paperwork, which is not for this meeting, it's just a message to the county perhaps, is to say, while we totally understand the idea, and we do it all the time in the rural areas, it happens all the time, just going back to one of the questions, that there's no objection to drop curbs for vehicles. A lot of drop curbs are for vehicles rather than pedestrians, in order to provide access quite legitimately. It is some concern to me that we have what has been a grass verge of quite extensive nature, which in the end all gets tarmacked over. And I think we should send a message to the council to say, when you're giving these consents in these densely populated areas, please do consider the environmental impact of all the additional water that has been directed into the drains that would have gone into the earth, because we're paying for that through all sorts of mechanisms, costs an enormous amount of money to recycle it. It's putting pressure on drains that aren't big enough to take most of it anyway. And I really would urge that we send a message to the counties that says, please reconsider this standard use of tarmac whenever anybody asks you to tarmac over a bit of verge. Other further discussions, or anybody want to move anything, or we're not? If you want to move something, can we have the reasons for what you're saying, if it's anything other than what the officer's recommending? David.
I mean, clearly, as you would have detected, I guess, from my questioning thus far, I'm unhappy about the application. I mean, I know, obviously, in the report, the officers, and again, we use the word, I think, time and again, subjectively, suggest that this does comply with policies E1 and D4, and, you know, doesn't change the character of the area to an unacceptable degree. I mean, my view is different, and I think it does. And progressively, we will see these things changing the character of an area even further. I mean, coming back to the parking issue, which you so eloquently analysed there, Chair, I mean, in regard to the SPD and the way that we look at that, and whether we might actually, in a sense, refresh ourselves on that and see whether, you know, more relevant interpretations are necessary. I mean, as you know, Poplar's the ward that I represent, not this part of Popley, by the way, but it's the same area. And the simple facts are very different to some of the rural areas. We obviously have massive parking problems because of 40, 50-year-old estates with totally inadequate parking provision now for what was the concept then. And that is bad enough. And this council is spending millions of pounds seeking to increase that parking provision in a whole range of ways, trying to get some priority list. And in Popley alone, we have got dozens of cul-de-sacs on that list, and every person in those cul-de-sacs would say ours is the worst example and they're all as bad as each other. But here we are in this situation where we, in my view, approving applications of this sort, exacerbate it even further. Because A, we increase the parking requirement, and B, to be frank, we don't really have any absolutely satisfactory way of providing it within the curtilage of the dwelling concerned. So by definition, we cop out on this, and we know what will happen. We know that for convenience, and because nobody wants to be disadvantaged in the way they park their vehicle with the danger of somebody else blocking them in or the like, people leave them out on the road, they fly park them, they put them on grass verges, they put them on all sorts of areas. And when I talk to the local police about it, they say, well, if you want us to spend all of our time actually slapping notices on people where we're entitled to do it, we can do that, but that is a nonsense. And this type of application, I think, just adds to really the deterioration of this area in regard to its parking provision, and fundamentally, as I say, changes the character of the area from the sort of family units into something else. And I object to that type of application, and I resist it on this occasion, Chair. Happy to move that, Chair, at this juncture so that we've got that on the table, if I may. I'm moving refusal.
Diane?
Just before we vote on it, obviously we've got...
Oh, we haven't got any seconding it yet.
We
so
haven't yet, no.
No great rush.
We've got to look at the inspector's ruling on 106 Melrose Walk. It doesn't mention in this bit that you quote anything about parking. He was talking about the character of the area. Was the parking similar, or is there a garage at 106? Is there spaces for 2 on-site parking spaces, 106, or was it assumed that there'd be a similar scenario to here, which is that cars would just park outside the curtilage?
Unfortunately, I haven't got the details with me, but from a recollection, I believe that parking was very similar, if not identical to that's being proposed here, but I couldn't confirm that for you. That was certainly the case. To be honest, that's my understanding, but we'd need to check the details for you before we can confirm that 100%.
David?
Simple person like me from Tadley. So are we saying that there was no parking in the curtilage before? There was a garage space and a space. Okay. Okay, that's all I wanted to know.
I think there was, in practical terms, a garage, originally a garage and a space for a car in front of the garage, effectively. Marilyn?
Just say, I think from memory, the house that had been given the permission, which is now no longer, they had not converted the garage. The garage is still there. I'm not so sure that it's being used as a garage, but the garage is certainly still there.
I think the answer was, without looking it up, we don't definitively know. But can we look at that previous application now and the inspectorate's ruling, and just make sure we do know what the parking provision was? However, the point has been made, members, that this is a progressive activity, and therefore the inspector doesn't have to make the same decision each time. The inspector could come to the conclusion that enough's enough, and this area has been, enough development has taken place. So at some stage, as officers say, at some stage the point would be reached where that is the case, and it's really, anybody would judge one way or another whether that point has been reached. So that the precedent of the previous decision at the appeal is not a defining precedent any more than any other appeal decision is defining, unless it's defining a point of policy as opposed to the subjective view of the environment in a particular location.
In terms of 106, the plan that you can just see the extract of there is, the proposal was to remove the internal garage so that it would be a floor plan very similar to what's being proposed here. I think the difference is that 106 had 2 parking spaces. That was the appeal decision that was allowed, is that it had 2 spaces within the curtilage. So that would be the difference between this application and 106 Melrose.
It's been proposed that for refusal, but there's been nobody seconding that. Do we have an alternative? Right, seconded by Councillor Hood, just narrowly ahead of Councillor Bound. Are there any other points anyone wants to make? Can we elucidate, please, members, before voting in our normal way now, what are the reasons for refusal if it is voted for refusal? People know the basis on which we're voting.
Sorry, Chair, if I may. I mean, obviously I did, I think, make reference to policies E1 and D4, and I argue that there is non-compliance with those policies, and I would argue that this does significantly change the character of the area to an unacceptable degree. I mean, as you rightly point out, Chair, that's my view about the threshold having been reached, and I make that view public on that basis, really. I also would want to add to that, obviously, our concerns about parking provision, really, which we believe to be ineffective and not contained within the curtilage of the dwelling, such that it would give us confidence that those parking spaces would be used in that way, and by definition would exacerbate the general parking concerns that apply in that area. So I think there's a couple of areas there, if I may.
And you presumably would elucidate the evidence of the site visit to the fact that that is not how people practically park in the area.
Thank you, Chairman.
I expect you would, wouldn't you?
I would, Chairman. Thank you. As usual, you're very helpful. Thank you.
Anything to add to that, anybody, before we vote on that motion? Yeah, George.
Listening to what was said earlier, I have good concern as well about access from outside. Sorry, what was said earlier, I have got concern about the access. Yeah, and which is very important, I think, is the fact that the county should be playing a more important role, because at any time I feel the county could step in there and say no parking on the Queen's Highway, because I don't think there's any planning permission at the moment for the applicant to have access to go in and leave this side.
So, sorry, this is not a condition. This is nothing to do with the reasons for refusal. This is, I mean, this is a point, we can make that point later, but I think I'm focusing on reasons for refusal. You know, the council could put yellow lines all around the thing, but I don't think you'd be immensely popular with residents if we went out doing that. I know how my residents would react. Marilyn, did you want to say something additional on reasons?
Just the comment about what we saw on the ground. Make sure that it is marked up that it was actually during the daytime and not when most of the cars would be there in the evening or weekend.
Well, I suspect that if we voted for refusal on the grounds we're now citing, officers would definitely, before it went to appeal, if it went to appeal, would actually take the evidence, and there would be clear evidence, photographic and otherwise, as to the actual practice of parking as opposed to the theory, because that would be one of the key grounds for the decision. Anything else from anyone? Those in favour of refusal? Okay, the application is refused on the grounds that have been summarised. Officers want to add any other? Well, you can vote against, yes. I don't really bother with that if it's a clear refusal, because we don't record the vote here. Officers want to summarise or add anything?
Okay, officers can confirm that members have resolved to refuse the application on the grounds of the harm to the character of the area and the inadequate parking provision. Officers would also add in that Section 106 would have been required, so that will need to be forming part of the refusal reason, if not a refusal reason in itself.
I do urge that if it were to go to appeal, that the authority should actually get some firm evidence as to the facts of how people park in this particular vicinity, which is clearly the issue which is most concerning to residents, in addition to the replicable effect of converting one after another dwelling. Right, we move on to item 2. Byfleet Avenue, and my other bits of paper. I am expecting Mr. Nardi to speak to us. And so just to check, I'm not aware of anybody wishing to speak other than Mr. Nardi, any members or... if you're not registered to speak, so if you would like to just speak to one of the officers here, just come down the side of the table. We need to have people registered if they wish to... Sorry, do you wish to speak? No. No? Wrong one. Wrong application. Oh, we don't have... Right. If you just sit there for a moment, Mr. Nardi, then we'll get officers to present the case.
Thank you, Chair. Item number 2 is an application for a new 3-bedroom dwelling with garage and crossover on land to the rear of 25 and 27 Byfleet Avenue in Old Basing. The application is brought before committee due to the number of objections to the proposal and the officer recommendation of approval subject to completion of a legal agreement. The update paper recommends an additional condition to ensure the proposed parking space is implemented as per the proposed plans.
You have 4 minutes.
Firstly, I'd like to thank the committee for this opportunity to make a representation. It will probably not surprise the committee to learn that the scheme presented has been the outcome of numerous discussions and revisions with both the case officer and the highway officer. This has taken place over a period of some considerable time, commencing with an official inquiry last March. During that consultation period, the proposed dwelling has been remodelled with particular emphasis on handing it. This has resulted in the vehicular access being located to the west of the site to afford greater safety. Vehicular access is sited some 50 metres from the junction with Byfleet Avenue and some 25 metres from the curvature of Apple Way. The 50 metres from this site to the junction has no other access points until reaching 13 Apple Way opposite. Properties in the cul-de-sac Apple Way have integral garaging and driveways affording off-street parking. The dwelling has additionally been repositioned on site to afford a greater distance of some 9 metres between the rear of number 1 Apple Way to the east. It has always been a definite design decision to ensure that a single-storey element and no first floor overlooking exists to the boundary facing 1 Apple Way. It is accepted that standard permitted development rights would be removed. The only first floor window overlooking the gardens of 25 and 27 Byfleet Avenue serves a shower room. From the outset, the principle of development in this location has been accepted as entirely within policy guidelines. Whilst using the end of 2 adjoining rear gardens, numbers 25 and 27 Byfleet Avenue would continue to enjoy a minimum of 18 metres garden length. Subdivision of the plot entirely reflects the opposite side of Apple Way, i.e. numbers 31 and 33 Byfleet Avenue. It also accords with plot sizes in Apple Way. The rear garden of the proposal would be 10 metres. This is larger than a number of properties within Apple Way. The property location would identify with these houses in this respect. In my opinion, it would not be acceptable to completely identify with the design style of properties in Apple Way. Chalet-style dwellings, and particularly flat roofs, have been actively discouraged for some time. This is stated within the Old Basing and Litchpit design statement. The height of the proposal is only around half a metre or just under higher than those in Apple Way. The distance separating first floor frontage windows from the dwelling to those opposite, i.e. numbers 12 and 13 Apple Way, is an accepted 20 metres. Indeed, this distance normally applies to back-to-back gardens. A Section 106 agreement has been drafted and agreed in principle. The officers may be able to update the committee on this going issue. Any approval would be subject to finalisation of such an agreement. In conclusion, the proposed dwelling is within all guidelines. Subdivision of the plot is commensurate with its opposite location. After considerable consultation...
Just under a minute, sir.
Thank you. After considerable consultation, the design is considered acceptable. Amenity facilities for both the subdivided properties and the new proposal are entirely acceptable. Parking requirements accord with standard requirements. Safe access is a considerable distance away from a junction. Great care has been taken to ensure privacy and avoid undue overlooking. This has been achieved within all accepted design guidelines. Once again, thank you for this opportunity to speak, and I hope you're able to approve the scheme.
Thank you, sir. If you just sit there, if you press your big black button again. Any questions from members, Paul?
Thank you, Chair. You used an expression I'm not familiar with at this particular stage of the application, and that was official inquiry. Could you please describe what an official inquiry in this context is, please?
Yes, pre-application inquiry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, Mr. Nardi. Can you just confirm the distance between the gable end of the property we're talking about here and the rear elevation? I think it's number 1 Apple Way, isn't it, that we see on both plans? And the second part of my question, I mean, just to confirm my interpretation of your drawings, there are no windows on that gable end of the dwelling you're designing here, is that right?
I'll answer the second part first. Yes, you're right. There are no windows on that side elevation, and in accordance with the planning officer's report and my measurements, it is something like 9 metres between the two.
Any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Nardi. If you'd like to withdraw, I don't have any other speakers on this, so members' questions to the officers, if there are any. No discussion? Sven, are you going to speak as the ward councillor, or?
Yeah, I will speak as ward councillor, if I may. I mean, the parish council is not very happy with this application. I personally have nothing against it, but in the circumstances, I feel it probably not appropriate for me to actually recommend approval. So on that basis, I will personally be abstaining from the discussion and the voting. Thank you.
Just as a comment before other members speak, I was reading the report. The parish council says it goes against guideline 5 of the village design statement. It'd be very helpful if officers or the parish council, when sending it in, could actually spell out what guideline 5 is. Because we all know what our policies are, but we don't remember all the details of every. I'm sure Sven can tell us, and it may be what they've said here, but it's not clear.
I can probably help on that. The village design statement is opposed to infilling in back gardens. Thank
you. Simply going to say I quite appreciate that local residents never like anything built in back gardens, and I appreciate that. Nobody local is going to like it. But I've looked through all the reasons for objecting from both the parish and individuals, and I can't see any good planning reason to refuse this. And so I would propose approval of it. Thank
you. That's been proposed and seconded for approval. David, did you want to say something on some? You were, right. Are there any other speakers? Proposed and seconded for approval. Those in favour of approval? That is approved. Officers, summarise, please.
The application has been approved, subject to completion of the legal agreement.
Can we move on to item 3 on the agenda? Item 3 and item 4 are the same site, and if we have... I'm expecting Mr. Nash and Mr. Zurbir. Now, do they speak first or objectors? Objectors. Mrs. Nash and Mr. Zurbir are here to speak. If you'd like to come forward, please now. If you would. Just come forward to the front table there. And if you just sit down for the moment, we'll get officers to present the report. Then I'm expecting to hear from either or both of Mr. Lasseter and Mr. Joel, but I don't have a ward councillor due to speak, but we do have one here, I think. So if you just wait for us to have the officers present their report. Thank you.
Okay, item 3 is the proposed change of use of from a single dwelling house to an 11-bed house in multiple occupation. The application is brought to committee given the number of objections received. There's no update on this item, and the recommendation is therefore remaining to approve subject to the conditions set out in the report.
I should have mentioned that these are on the same site, but this is not like a listed building and planning application. This is 2 distinct applications for 2 different things. They will be handled as 2 distinct separate applications as on the agenda. And I will give the speakers opportunity to come back and speak to the second one if they wish to, or if they've got something quite different to say, or to come back to the table and answer questions on the second one if they don't think they want to say anything new when we've heard the first one and decided it. So we will handle them as 2 separate applications in every normal way. So if you'd like to speak to the first application, you can speak to both if you like at the same time, but please speak to the first application anyway. You have 4 minutes.
Right, my name's Henrik Zerby. I live at number 43. We have 2 main objections, London Road. We have 2 main objections to this. The first one is the access and egress to the property. Whilst we appreciate there have been some changes made to the crossover, it still appears that the crossover is still up on the downstream side of the light head. So the the vehicles coming out of that property will not be able to see one of the light heads. for the traffic lights.
Sorry, it may be only me. Can you explain what a light head is?
The traffic lights, that's the four-way junction. And I believe there have been a number of issues and accidents on that junction. So as you can see, one of the light heads is there, and the crossover will be just this side, or the traffic, the crossover or the junction side of that light, which means that the people coming in and out of that turning or into that crossover will not be able to see that. The other thing is, we're talking about cars. At the moment, there is a 7.5-ton lorry parked in that car park. There are two things there. I mean, I'm sure the design of that car park and the design of that crossover has not been designed for a 7.5-ton lorry. And the second thing, to have a 7.5-ton lorry working, you need an O license. Or working, and I doubt it, as that is not a commercial property that has an O license. So our objection is quite strong on the fact that, you know, it's not just going to be for car parking. There are lorries parked in there now. There are other vans in there that are 3.5 ton in weight. So that is, and they're coming. People will just not, you know, they will not be able to see that light. And I dare say again that crossover will not be built for that type of vehicle. The second point is the planners have said that there'll be no undue loss of privacy. Well, that's untrue. When this dormer windows were originally put into that property, the council, I believe, put an order for those dormer windows to be removed. The council decided not to pursue that because they couldn't prove that they hadn't put, those dormer windows hadn't been put in when it was a domestic property. Although it's never been, well, in my time there, had never been run as a domestic property, it's always been run as a business. So now the proposal is that you agree, or the planners want to agree to them turning this into a commercial property. If they'd been able to prove at the time it was a commercial property, they would have then pursued having the dormer windows removed. So we've been allowed to have the dormer windows because it wasn't a commercial property, and now the suggestion is that we're going to allow that to become a commercial property, and at one point, so those are our real main objections to that. Also, it might be pointed out that the new property built next door to that had to have its windows opaqued.
You have a minute left.
I don't think I have anything more to say on that.
Well, I'd just like to say that it's very busy, that area. There's a chip shop opposite and a garage. There are children walking past and pedestrians there. It's on a bus route. And one young man lost his life there in the past, and the air accident has been deployed at least once, to my knowledge.
Press your big white black button and stay there for a minute, because we'll see if members would like to ask you any questions. You're not required to answer, but they sometimes do. David.
If I've missed this in the report, I'm sure I'll be told, but in terms of the access and egress from this site within the traffic signal junction area, has that always been the case? I mean, from my memory, I mean, in terms of where you used to get into this property and where you got out, it's always been in the same place. So what we'd be talking about, and your concern, is an increase in the number of vehicles. Is that right?
I believe the ejections have been there's been a number of planning applications on that property. I believe that they've all been rejected because of the access and egress of that. And as far as, yes, also it should be a domestic property, and you're right, you know, it's always been running, I don't know if it's illegally, but I don't think it's ever had planning permission to run as a commercial property. So you're right, yes, sorry.
Confirmation, really. The actual vehicular access and exit is in the same place as has been proposed under this application.
I believe so, but the other application, yes, and the fact that they've got larger vehicles in there is also of a major concern, particularly a 7.5-ton lorry.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, both of you. If you'd like to just go back to your pews. Do you wish to speak as ward member? Oh, I'm sorry. Well ahead of myself, aren't I? If you'd like to come forward, sir, and you probably understand the form by now. You have to press the big black button, and you have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. We're going to follow Mr. Inca's lead in item 1 and have nothing to say, but quite happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Questions, Sven?
Well, I'd like to ask a question to the applicant. First of all, I mean, may we assume that it would be your intention to park these lorries there normally?
No, that's not the case. It's been rented out as a single dwelling, and obviously, if you give me permission, we have more control of the people who live there.
I also ask you, you've got 2 applications in, one for a house of multiple occupation and one for 10 bedrooms. Should this committee be mindful to pass one of them, which would you prefer to be passed?
We're still analysing our options, so we're undecided at this present time.
So you're not willing to give an opinion as to which you'd prefer?
We haven't made a decision yet.
Any other questions from members? Yes, Marilyn.
Am I right in understanding that the access proposed now is in a slightly different position to the present one?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the access, the issue with the access was considered at the appeal in 2010, and the inspector there felt that everything was okay, but the access needed to be widened. So the access stays in the same place, but is being widened to enable 2 vehicles to pass.
The application in the report states this is a change of use from residential dwelling to an 11-bed house in multiple occupation. Could you tell me, are those 11 single beds, are they multiple beds in a single bedroom? Are they multiple units within the 11 of any kind of combination of 11? And exactly how it's constructed? Because that's rather relevant to the parking standards. And I see no mention of the parking standards in the report.
We propose 11 bedrooms, but the HMO licensing team can restrict the number of residents allowed to stay in the property. So if you've got a single bed or a double bed, it will be up to them to decide how many people are allowed to live in that particular unit.
It's a long time since I dwelt in houses of multiple occupation. You can probably tell from my age. But it's not clear to me, if you could possibly explain, looking at the layout we see here, what facilities other than the ensuite shower and loo do I get if I'm the occupant of number 11, for example, or some other room in the dwelling? Is everything that I get inside 11? I don't see any shared. There's a communal lounge, and this is also a kitchen and dining room. That's the shared facility, is it?
Yes, that is. We've had discussions with the HMO licensing team, and they've measured all the bedrooms and the communal spaces, and they were happy for those facilities for the 11 bedrooms.
And any other questions from members? No? Thank you both. If you'd like to withdraw again. Do you wish to speak as ward councillor on this? Yes? Fine. We have questions to officers first then.
If I may ask one question. As far as the dormer, I think we all understand that the history of this particular site is a very sorry one, and much as I hate criticising borough officers, they haven't come out particularly well in this particular circumstance. I think the dormer window, I think the gentleman was saying that that he inquired about the dormer. My understanding, when the dormer window, because I complained violently about the dormer window when it was first put in, and I was told that it would have been permitted under permitted development rights if an application had gone in, which of course it hadn't. But can I ask the borough officers whether they feel that is correct, that if anything had been done about it, it would have been permitted under permitted development rights?
Okay, as I understand it, and it's reflected in the officer's report here, is at the time that the investigation into the dormer window took place, it was concluded that the dormer window was undertaken in accordance with the permitted development rights at the time, therefore it was a lawful development. It didn't require a planning application. For that reason, no further action was taken because it didn't need to be taken. There'd been no change to that now. It's a lawful development in terms of that dormer that was erected.
I would like, as a ward councillor, to make a statement at some point, but I don't want to ask any more questions of the officers. Thank you.
I just wanted, for the benefit of the webcast, just in case there's any confusion, to assure anybody who might view the webcast that what the member either said or intended to say was that he protested vehemently. Some people may have heard him say, I protested violently, and I'm sure he did not intend that. Just want to want any confusion on this matter. Other questions to officers? Paul. Paul and then Chris.
I'm going to raise the subject of parking again. This is why I asked the question of the applicant. I notice that the Highway Authority, which presumably covers parking, has no comment. We would like to know, bearing in mind other applications come through, there are very specific rules about parking. I'm not familiar with the site. We didn't have a site visit to this one. And bearing in mind how it was answered by the applicant, my question on numbers, what numbers are considered to be appropriate? Is it just straight 11 bedrooms? Then we apply the formula. Is there sufficient parking? Is there sufficient consideration of the ingress and egress? Thank you. It went sufficiently close to that junction. I know that junction very well, and to have potentially a whole number of cars trying to exit that junction, it's going to get blocked. It's a very busy junction, especially in the mornings, because the 8:30 they're really roaring past there. That's my question, Chair. Is what formula was applied? Why isn't it in the report? Because I wouldn't ask the question if it was in the report. Page 31? Okay. But for the benefit of anyone else, what formula was applied to this?
For developments of this nature, the starting point is one space per bedroom. That would give the 11 spaces. However, in this case, the applicant has undertaken a transport assessment, which has undertaken a review of census data for the surrounding area, which has concluded that the likely level of ownership is going to be in the region of 0.69. So timesing that by the 11 gets close to 8. In reality, they're actually providing 9 parking spaces within the curtilage of the property. The provision of that parking is also coupled with other improvements, including the widening of the access, allowing the two cars to pass each other. Also, taking into account the proximity of the signals, the improvements to that access will also include the provision of an inductive loop within the access, which will detect the presence of a vehicle wishing to wait within that access to join the highway. That will then allow the signals to give a greater green time to vehicles as they exit Byfleet Avenue, so that this waiting vehicle, can then join that queue once it has passed the access. Although the exiting driver is to the south of the signal head to his right, he does have a view of the secondary signal head, which is to his left. Therefore, he is aware of how the traffic lights are operating at the time he is waiting to join the highway.
And at the end of all that, you can offer the assurance that that is a safe egress. There's many to do with egress from the particular property. That is safe.
Taking into consideration the proposed improvements, our conclusion and our recommendation is that it is considered to be safe and suitable.
Cool. And then Sven.
Sorry, Sven. Yeah, just
Sorry,
one brief.
Chris, were you there? Had you?
All I was going to say.
I think I had noticed you. Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
And then Michael, and then Sven.
Yeah, honestly, it's quick. It was just that was it. That was my question, to hear actually that you're confident that this junction will work, and thank you for that.
Sorry, just in terms of the layout, I'm sort of looking at the plans, is it sort of a one sort of entrance, and then there's one sort of stairwell that goes up? And I was just wondering about, are fire people consulted on this sort of conversion?
That's a matter that be considered under the building regulations.
Sven?
Yes, can I just ask the highways officer, you can confirm, can't you, that the system that you described for allowing cars exiting to do so with some safety by burying this sensor in the ground underneath them, that the applicant has agreed that he will fund that himself, because I believe it's quite an expensive piece of equipment. My understanding from the case officer was that the applicant had taken on the responsibility of providing that piece of equipment. Thank you.
Certainly my understanding is that the new inductive loop to sit within the existing access forms part of the proposals. My understanding is that planning condition 3, the intention of that is to ensure that all the necessary highway improvements are provided.
David, I think was next.
Thank you, Chair. If I may, just an observation and the question, if I may. I mean, as I understand it, on the on-site parking provision, which Councillor Miller's made reference to, I mean, we're talking about 9, and not being able to get more than that is because of the provision, is it for secure long stay and 12 short stay cycle parking places? And if you'd allow me just to digress for a second, in regard to the second application, which we'll come to, I notice they're going to have 10 car parking spaces there, and even there obviously there's provision for cycle parking spaces, anticipating I suppose people coming for bed and breakfast on bicycles, which is probably a bit strange, I think, really. But I mean, can we discuss that in due course, how that provision applies? But there's slight changes within the two applications in regard to those parking spaces. The point I try to make, not very well obviously, but if we were to seek a slight improvement in on-site parking provision for this HMO, I can call it that this time, can't I? It would be possible if we were to move slightly away from the parking provision for cycles, would it? Is that, I haven't seen I can't make out on that scale plan exactly what's actually being proposed.
Okay, I think from what I understand of the two proposals is that the difference is that the second proposal doesn't include a small amenity area that takes up some of the land. So that there's, on the proposal for the HMO, there's a small amenity area to the rear of the property, whereas it's all hard standing in the second application.
Sorry, Chair, if you like, I mean, just as an observation, it's obviously the planning officer's commentary on this, but in terms of parking provision, I think Councillor Miller makes the point as I would seek to, just to check it with you. But I think it is vital that this type of thing consumes its own smoke in terms of its parking requirements. And by definition, I would have thought that at the very minimum, really, 11 spaces were required, really. That's going to be a reasonable analysis, I think, of the type of uses it's going to get, probably plus others when you think of the odd guest person who will come and go, whether they'll stay overnight. I have no observation to make on that at this juncture, but certainly 11 would be the minimum, it seems to me, and we should seek to try and get that incorporated within the design.
Does have any observations to make on that?
I think the only comment that I can make is that the applicant has supported his position with reference to census data as set out within his transport assessment. At the present time, my colleague who has assessed this application is unable to provide any data to prove that a higher parking standard, a higher parking requirement is necessary. So on that basis, we've had to accept the applicant's transport assessment as it is presented because it does seem reasonable on the statistics they provided.
I would like to pick up on the question of trucks and vans, and just precede that with the comment about this question of propensity of people living in HMOs to have motor cars. Government policy has changed quite radically in the last 18 months to the point where HMOs are distinctly approved. They're a good idea at the planning policy level for fairly obvious reasons. It seems to me self-evident that the implication of that is that the types of people who will seek to live in HMOs will change because it will encompass a wider cross-section of the population, and there'll be a higher propensity, particularly in rural and semi-rural areas, for people living in HMOs to actually own a motor vehicle, or, and this brings me back to the question that was asked earlier, or the point that was made earlier about lorries and vans, or to come home in a vehicle they don't own, but which is provided by their employer, because I'm a driver, and we know very well that in some parts of the borough there is a very high propensity for vans and trucks to arrive. In parts of my ward, particular areas have a quite high propensity for not a car but a van or a truck. In the report coming to the question, we say the space is allowed for motor vehicles. Do we mean spaces suitable for cars?
In the way in which the car parking layout has been presented, the dimension of those bays are what I would expect for cars, yes.
Move on to debate. Does the Ward Councillor wish to speak?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Well, as I think, as many of you will have gathered by now, that the history of this particular site is a rather sorry one, but obviously we are where we are. And the main difficulty was that when the original application to turn an electrical storage warehousing facility into a single domestic residence was given, the then applicant turned it into, I think it was an 8-bedroom bed and breakfast, he was reported to enforcement. Sadly, enforcement, of course, as is their normal activity, told him he must ask for retrospective planning permission, which is a very correct approach to take. He absolutely refused to do so. So for a very, very long time there was a stalemate because enforcement weren't willing to take it any further. He then sold it on to, eventually to the current applicant. Anyway, we are where we are, but I mean the difficulty we have here is that the parish council is violently opposed to either of the, and I mean violently.
Oh.
And of course, I have to say that the vast majority of local residents who live on Byfleet or close to the proximity are very, very concerned about it. The great difficulty we have is that a previous application which was turned down by both the parish and the borough was appealed to the inspector, and the inspector didn't grant the appeal, but the only problem he had was with the highway entrance and exit. He seemed happy with it on all other points, and I mean the fact of the matter is that highways are now satisfied that those concerns have been dealt with. I would disagree with that, but nevertheless they are satisfied that that's been dealt with, which means, and I've discussed this at length with the case officer, that if we were to turn it down and it were appealed, the appeal would almost certainly be granted, and we would then have costs awarded against us, and I don't think that's a very sensible course of action to take. So in the circumstances, I think we need to consider granting some sort of permission, but we need to try and get as many conditions put on and as many things changed as we feel it would be reasonable to ask for. But we are between a rock and a hard place on this one, sadly. Thank you.
Just for the avoidance of doubt, it's my understanding, and officers can confirm this perhaps, that the appeal which was turned down on grounds of access was actually for a guest house, not for an HMO dwelling. And so there's no precedent here for the HMO dwelling. There's no guidance on that. Other members wish to speak on this? Paul?
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'll concur with your comments about the occupants of HMOs. The fact that it's just not cars. It can be a multitude of vehicles. If somebody drives a 7.5 ton truck into this and tries to park it, it's just going to deny anybody else any structured parking access at all. We can't look into a crystal ball. I think that, bearing in mind it's 11 bedrooms, I think it's incredibly optimistic to look at data and formulae when we all know what happens in real life. Now, real life is not a policy matter that you can turn something down, but we know what's going to happen. It's going to be a parking disaster. I'm convinced of it. And that is my main concern. Because I can't object to it, bearing in mind on policy grounds, or vote against it, I certainly won't be supporting it, because I still think there's a flaw in the argument about the number of parking spaces in this particular location. That's one thing. And the whole concept of it, when we look at single residencies with so many bedrooms, and you get a multiple applied, not a reduction applied. To my mind, it's mathematical nonsense. And we keep hearing that I didn't have the right data. Everything is a data. Everything's a desktop exercise. Get out there and look at what problems are created by the lack of a provision of adequate parking. So I'm not going to say any more, but I'm certainly not going to vote for this. I'll probably abstain, but I can't support the application.
Thank you, Chair. Just on the issue of parking, I suppose as a principal, Chair, I understand the point that Councillor Miller's making about what actually happens on the ground in a real life situation, and obviously that was a point on the earlier application. But I think in terms of dealing with a planning application, we have a local plan policy which talks about application of the parking standards in a flexible way. That's the council's policy. So the starting point is 11 spaces. The data that's been provided is evidence effectively in the application. We have to take that into account. It is material to the application, so it's entirely right that it is assessed by the highways officer and taken into account the location of the site, the improvements that have been made to the access, the provision of public transport, etc., etc. The conclusion is that 9 spaces in this instance is appropriate. I appreciate members may have a different view on that, but I think it is entirely appropriate that evidence has been weighed by the highways officer in coming to their conclusion.
Marilyn.
This is something I've never thought of before. Is it possible to say that no commercial vehicles be parked there?
I think that type of condition is possibly quite difficult to enforce, but in any case, I think there needs to be possibly a better way of doing it is if there's not really a condition about marking out the spaces, because I think the likelihood of a vehicle of that size being parked in that sort of location, if indeed the envisaged sort of parking demand is so high that there would normally be cars there, I think the likelihood of that is pretty slim. The other aspect of this is that I don't think parking standards can be required to, cover absolutely every possible outcome. I think it needs to be looked in terms of what's probable on a sort of typical day-to-day basis. No, it wouldn't prevent a delivery vehicle, for example, turning up on site at one particular time. But I suppose it's looking at what's more likely on a sort of typical day. And the reason, I suppose, one of the reasons for the parking provision being provided as shown on that plan is because of that sort of turning facility provided to accommodate that. So I think the view of officers is that in trying to accommodate all aspects of what else is required by this site, 9 spaces is, if you like, the best that could be provided.
It's the same issue, sorry, Chair, if you'll bear with me, in terms of parking provision, and it's the way we approach these things. I remember not so long ago, we dealt with a similar in the sense it was a conversion of an existing dwelling into an HMO in Worthing Road, and just on the junction, people will remember that, opposite the Morrisons establishment. And the sort of arguments we were able to employ there, I think, which got us over the hurdle of inadequate on-site parking provision for the number of units, were, I think, around the areas, well, it's a very relatively quiet street in which this dwelling is, and an overflow. In other words, people parking where they're allowed to adjacent to the property would not be harmful, would not be a danger. And in terms of the ability of people not necessarily to need a vehicle there because they were not so far away from the town centre and they had shopping facilities available, all of those things, we were persuaded and convinced ourselves really that was reason for approval with less than the right number of parking spaces for the units concerned. But here in Basing, with the best will in the world, I know it's not a bad bus service, but it's not a brilliant one, and that's probably a comment made about the whole of Basingstoke really, but in terms of the type of people that we can genuinely predict, never mind the sort of demographic criteria that people keep trying to refer to, the likelihood is everybody who resides in this 11 unit is going to have a vehicle of some sort, either their own vehicle or, as you say, Chair, they're going to bring their own van home from work because that suits that employer and suits the individual employee for the start of their day. And the other alternatives are very limited. Byfleet Avenue, you can't park in Byfleet Avenue anywhere near where this dwelling is. You certainly can't park in London Road. And we really then are storing up a significant problem. I only have the plan to work on that I have in front of me like everybody else. I guess the amenity area, so described, which I guess is at the end of the row of 6 parking spaces, is probably intended for, I don't know, some sort of clothes drying facility and things of that sort. Again, I don't know if there's any compromise on that, but it seems to me a couple of additional spaces could be provided there really. And it does seem to me that ought to be an amendment to the design that suits what we are looking to achieve here. I'd be far more willing to support this if I was content that we had actually got adequate parking provision within the curtilage of the site. And I think that's very important on occasions that we do that. You know, I know what I've said earlier tonight, and I know, but this is a very different situation. This is an HMO proper, and it's important that we do contain parking right within this site curtilage. And I think unless that is achieved, I'm unhappy about approving it.
Sven.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to put in a bit of a suggestion, really. I mean, accepting that the parking requirements have been met, if this is going to be an HMO, would it not be reasonable to say that a small number of allocated parking spaces should be provided for visitors, guests, parents, etc., within the curtilage? And is there any opportunity for the committee to indicate to the applicant that we have some sympathy with his application, but we would like him to go away and see if he can't be a bit more generous with the parking arrangements? Thank you.
Yes, so that's not something that can be dealt with in this committee, or indeed officers can't be authorised. Well, authorised. We could authorise officers to try and have that negotiation, but the committee's job is to either approve or refuse the application, as we well understand. If nobody else wants to speak, because I'd like to say a few words. Do you want to come back? Yeah.
I just wanted to say that if we were to go along that way, can it not be deferred for negotiation rather than a yes or no?
Well, we could defer the application for further discussion and give some guidance to officers as to what we would like to see come back. My own view on this, I mean, the question was raised with the applicant, which of these actually would you like to actually develop? And there was no, the answer is we don't know, or we haven't decided. And therefore we've no idea what's in the applicant's mind. However, it seems to me, I am, just to start with, very strongly in favour of HMOs. I lived happily as an HMO for some of the best years of my life. And I have no objection to them. However, they're a damn good thing in the right place. They work very well in urban areas. They work very well in cities. They work on bus routes and close to railway stations and, in my case, underground stations and so forth. And they don't work so well in less accessible geographical locations. And in the modern age of motor cars, they don't work very well where it's difficult to park, frankly. And I don't care what the census data might say. Census data is remarkably unreliable. Each census has got less reliable than the previous one. But that's nothing to do with this committee at all. But it's a well-known fact, and it's on the record by the people who take the census. But it takes no account of how policy will change the future, and I've mentioned the policy that will change the future of HMOs, possibly for the better. The question is here, members have the opportunity to either approve both applications and then leave it to the applicant to decide what to do next, to refuse both applicants and leave it to the applicant to decide whether to appeal on one or both of them, or to approve one and refuse the other. And my own personal, I don't usually express a view one way or the other on these things, but nobody seems to be very clear, frankly, to me. And my own personal view is I don't think this works as an HMO. I think it's in the wrong place. I don't like this idea of assuming that they're all going to have, effectively with a visitor, not one parking space each, and it's all assumed they're going to be cars, because my direct experience in the last 5 or 6 years is that they aren't all cars. It's not the case that they are, and it's been made very clear that there's nowhere to park outside in any sensible way. So I worry about these things. I worry about the resident of a development, of a new development, not about the applicant, but the resident of the new development. And I see this leading to strife and discomfort. People desperately need the accommodation, so they'll take it without thinking, oh, what am I going to do about X? And therefore, I'm not at all happy with the application for this as an HMO, personally. Nobody seems to be wanting to move anything for anybody.
Sorry, Chair, I mean, taking your lead, I mean, my reservations were expressed, I think, really, and I think Councillor Tucker made the point about deferment, which I thought could achieve some improvement by discussion in respect of the one area that I've obviously commented on most of all in regard to parking provision. But I'd go further than that. I mean, if you're actually, and you can do it from the chair, can't you, moving refusal, I'll second that, because I think that will certainly encompass a number of the concerns that people are expressing around the table. I mean, I'm happy for you to take that lead. It's unlike you, but I'm pleased about it for a change.
Well, the only reason I do that is that nobody else seems to be moving anything either way, and somebody has to move something, otherwise the committee would be here all night, and the poor unfortunate applicant will be here listening to us not making any decisions all night, so I move refusal. The reasons being, as I've more or less summarised, that it is not an appropriate location for an HMO because it's not in a city and town environment, that it is not appropriate to have an HMO which only allows for, in that environment away from the town centre, that allows only for limited number of car parking spaces. There is no realistic facility for parking anywhere outside the site, and therefore it is not going to be an appropriate place for a dwelling for multiple occupation. And if anybody's got any other ideas, they're very welcome to chip in with them, but otherwise I'll put it to the vote. Those in favour of refusal? It's refused. Those in favour of approval, since I was asked to do that earlier? That's refused. So, officers?
Members have resolved to refuse the application on the grounds that it's an inappropriate location for a house in multiple occupation and the limited parking on site and provision for off-site.
Thank you. Now, you have the opportunity to come and talk to us again, or not, as you wish. All I'd say is you do come and talk to us again, or you can come and sit there and see if we've got any further questions. Anything we say now will be on the next application. We can't go back to the previous one and debate it. So, do you wish to open yourselves up to further questions or anything? Well, you have to come and sit. You have to come forward. Hmm? Oh, the objectors. Right, I'm sorry. You have the opportunity to speak again as well, if you wish. Before they do. Right. Yeah, no, well, we listened carefully to all that, and yeah, and you heard us raising some of the issues. So do you wish to come forward, sir? Yeah. And you again have 4 minutes.
Thank you. I don't need 4 minutes. I just wanted to draw to the members' attention the fact that this place operated as a B&B for probably 4 years as a 10-bed B&B, and in none of the representations has anybody suggested that there were amenity or highways issues during that period. Thank you.
Do members have any fresh questions? Thank you very much, sir. Any fresh questions to officers? I mean, we in a sense did discuss this to a large extent. The site was discussed and so forth. The point was made very clearly that the only objection by the inspectorate was access, and I am inclined, unless somebody wants to make a big debate of it, to move approval from the chair. Does anybody want to have a debate on that? No? It's been moved and seconded for approval. Those in favour of approval? Approved. Officers, confirm, please.
The application is approved, subject to completion of a legal agreement.
That's the end of the formal business of the meeting. If members would stay here for a few minutes, please. We have little discussion to have about the question of items that are sent on to PI, but the meeting's finished. If members of the public would like to withdraw, please